Now, if you've been following COVID-19 over the course of the last few weeks, you'll have seen a lot of numbers, a lot of data being thrown around. Some of it's quite baffling, and I'm not a doctor or an epidemiologist, but I know something about charts and about data. So let me talk you through why some of these data series really do matter, because COVID-19, the way that it spreads is very exponential, and showing that on charts is quite difficult. I'll show you why. Also, it's not quite clear how we compare ourselves either with other countries or indeed with the past, or what metric to use. So initially, a lot of people were looking at this. This shows you the number of cases in the UK, just on a kind of daily basis. You can see it mounting up, and if you add all of those together, you come to 20,000 cases, positive cases of COVID-19 in the UK. And actually, that would make the UK look pretty good, wouldn't it? So if you compare the UK with other countries, it's lower than France, Germany, China and the rest. But there's some issues with this. You've probably already noticed them. First of all, the US and the China have much bigger populations, so it's not necessarily very comparable there, is it? And other countries are doing far more testing. So Germany doing a lot more testing. They may well have actually about the same amount of COVID-19 in Germany, but they are certainly detecting more through their tests. But a better way of just judging what the trajectory for different countries is looking at how many people are dying of the disease. And if you look at that, here's a kind of picture of what we know so far. So these are the cumulative number of people who have died of COVID-19 in the UK over the course of the last few weeks. So initially, that line was doubling every 2 days, so rising quite steeply. Then it started to double every 3 days, so actually slightly less steeper growth rate. But this really matters, because if you carry on growing at the rate they are there, so doubling every 3 days, number of deaths, then you're heading up, before you know it, to 20,000 deaths, and that's within a fortnight. So from where we are now, up to 20,000 deaths could be within a fortnight if we carry on at that growth rate. The growth rate matters enormously. A lower growth rate, so doubling every 4 days, and you're talking about a shallower curve, and even just doubling every week, which doesn't sound like that much of a difference, does it? Look at how much difference it makes. Look at how different that line is. And that's why it's all important to think about the growth rate, not these absolute numbers. A lot of people are focusing on thousands and so on. It's about how fast it's growing. And you can't really see that from this line. So we've got a different way of charting this. It's called a logarithmic chart. It basically charts growth rates rather than absolute numbers. I'll take the same data here and convert it to a logarithmic axis, and just have a look at this. Exactly the same data, and what you can see is this line is much steeper at the start, because that's a steeper growth rate, and then it's getting a bit flatter, and then potentially, if you're doubling every week, it's getting even flatter. So a logarithmic chart, in this case, they matter. So I'm not a big fan of them in other parts of data, but in this case, it really does matter. And it matters too when you have a look at what's going on with the UK versus other countries. So some people have talked about charts like this. The UK, for instance, the US, Germany, this is the number of deaths again, look quite low compared with Spain and Italy, don't they? This is just in absolute terms. And that's why a lot of people are focusing on Spain and focusing on Italy, and some people think there's no problem in Germany and other countries. But convert this to a logarithmic chart, and it's a very different story. Have a look at this. Same data, exactly the same data. And what you can see is that pretty much all of the countries in Europe, certainly the ones we've got charted here, are moving in the same direction. Even Germany and the UK and the US. The UK is pretty much heading in line with Italy. And if focusing on the UK for a moment, if we carry on with our growth rate that we have at the moment, so doubling every 3 days, here's where we're heading. We're actually going to get into a steeper situation, rising towards 10,000 deaths, pretty much comparatively before Italy did. That's the power of these exponential growth rates. They are pretty terrifying, and that's why everyone wants to try and flatten these lines. And if you look at Spain, for instance, you get a little bit of hope there, a glimmer of hope. It's a terrible story in Spain. They have, as you can see here, a worse situation than Italy, but they instituted lockdown far earlier. So 14th of March, there was a lockdown across Spain. Because it takes about 2 weeks for the disease to take effect, it took a while for this lockdown to take effect as well. So the number of people dying still continued to double, even after that lockdown, every 3 days. But recently, a fortnight on, just over a fortnight on, actually, although the numbers are still horrible, the rate at which it's growing, the rate at which number of people dying is growing, is now down. So doubling every 6 days rather than every 3 days, a big difference. So it suggests they are starting to flatten that line. And that's part of the strategy in the UK. As I mentioned, it's not necessarily clear that countries like Germany and the Netherlands are heading in a different direction. In fact, they seem to be heading in pretty much the same direction as everyone else, which suggests that you're going to see many of the same policies implemented across Europe. It'd be interesting to keep an eye on what happens in Sweden, because they're doing it slightly differently over there. I should say this is not the only way of looking at the numbers, and there are some question marks about whether what are called COVID-19 deaths are comparable, whether they necessarily are comprehensive. So we are going to keep an eye on different data series as well. And one of them is this one. This is not just COVID-19 deaths in the UK. It's a weekly series just showing you the number of total deaths in Britain. Why does this matter? Because we can chart, we can compare, look at the bars versus the dotted line. We can compare how we're doing now with previous years. And if it turns out that these bars, which are slightly below the average of the last 5 years, that these bars in the coming weeks start to rise above the average, that suggests there's a real problem across the UK. We'll be keeping a close eye on this chart and all of the other charts because they give us a sense of where we might be heading in the course of the next few weeks.